In my personal favorite episode of this very podcast, I went to the Phantom of the Opera sites on Facebook, and I asked people what they thought about that show, that musical, and why it was that it worked for them so much. The follow-up question was whether or not they would come onto this podcast and speak about their experiences. Of the responses that I got, a surprising number of folks identified that they were neuroatypical. I didn't even know that that was true of them until they told me, and that was like halfway through most of the interviews. But their descriptions of hyperfocus and late life diagnoses were honestly more powerful than most of the topics that we have delved into on this show. I can't really say how much I respected those people and the stories that they shared. I don't want to present their lives like I have some master understanding of the issue, but I do think that just listening to what they had to say rounded out who they were as people and provided a whole new depth for what neurodivergence is and, importantly for this show, how all that relates to theater. This series, however, is about Hadestown. It's not about the Phantom. And the big bad isn't a shunned creature who lurks in the shadow. It's a god who rules over a third of the universe and is in charge of hell itself. The central character isn't a warped man living in the catacombs. It is the beautiful, naive poet who still believes that he can change the world with a song. So imagine my delight when I found in the hallowed pages of the academic journal Studies in Musical Theater an article that had the title, Hadestown's Orpheus, the Autistic Hero Musical Theater Didn't Know It Needed. I didn't know I needed it on this podcast either, but here we are. What is the connection between autism and Hadestown? Does it play out in the actual plot? Was it part of Anais Mitchell's rewriting of the Orpheus character as the show developed? We will crack the cover and leaf through the pages together on this episode of Theater, History, and Mysteries. I'm John Bruschke, and you are listening to Theater, History, and Mysteries, where I take a musical theater production, go into a deep dive on the questions it raises and the answers it provides. I hope that this approach will give a deeper understanding about the lessons that the musical has for theater and for life, and I will never miss an opportunity to pursue any mystery, bizarre coincidence, improbable event, or supernatural suggestion along the way because, in the words of Dirk Gently, it is all connected. Okay, so this is our 5th episode on Hades. I got 8 planned. I can't promise there won't be something else that becomes an interesting side quest, but that's the plan for now. The first 2 episodes have reviewed Roman history and the history of the Orpheus story, so that you kind of know where Hades, who Eurydice is and who Orpheus was and who they were in ancient Greece and how that evolved over time. In episodes 3 and 4, we reviewed the Anais Mitchell version of the story. The big takeaways from that were that Mitchell took the story and adapted it for some contemporary issues and into some more complex modern relationships. For the next 4 episodes, including this one, we're going to talk about how other people, fans and scholars and commentators have reacted to her themes. There's stuff in there about repression and relationships and the environment, and it's front and center of the show. You can't really miss it. And so a lot of people care about those issues, and they are reacting to what happened in Hadestown. They have a lot to say about it, and we'll do some deep dives on those issues. Before we get into that, here's my normal plea for your help. This podcast is something that I love doing. To be honest, I actually, when I'm lecturing at the university, I can throw together a lecture on argumentation or statistics in under an hour. There's one time I remember I was giving a 3-hour graduate seminar on multiple regressions, got halfway across the street, realized I had forgotten my notes, flipped over a napkin, wrote 5 words on it, and had no problem lecturing for 3 hours on that topic. But to make these episodes, it takes me like 6 hours each still, kind of, because they are new preparations for me, kind of just because I enjoy it and I can't stop myself from going into the side holes. But all that effort that goes into it is more than worth it to me as long as I know that there are people out there listening to it, and we need to maintain an audience. We need to maintain it and grow it in order for this to be sustainable. If you were to repost it, give it a like, those things really do make a difference. You've heard every podcaster ever ask you to do that, but if this is like the 7th or 8th episode that you have heard and you keep thinking, I'm going to get around to doing that or I'm going to do something about it, and you could do it now, that would really help. Just make sure that you've hit subscribe. And if you could, on whatever whatever way that you're comfortable doing it. Put the word out that this podcast has got something in it, and it's got something in it for people who like history or like musical theater or just like strange coincidences or even like the occasional ghost story. Like putting all that together, there's not really another place you can get this stuff on the internet. And so I'm happy to provide it. If you could help me spread the word, that means it's still going to be there for a while. Okay. In past episodes, I have made a big deal about citing your sources. I've got bibliographies on everything I've done. The bibliography I've got on Hadestown is very long. What is different about this episode is I'm going to base almost the entire thing on the work of Erica Wood. Erica Wood published her article in 2025. Erica goes to Stanford University and is an undergraduate with a double major in electrical engineering and the classics. The title of her article is, as I mentioned in the introduction, Hadestown's Orpheus, the autistic hero musical theater didn't know that it needed. And that was published in a journal called Studies in Musical Theater. And I've alluded to academic research. And for those of you who are not still in the academy, who graduated and moved on or did something else instead of going to college where you read all this stuff, academic journals are places where scholars, people who are trying to advance knowledge about something, submit their original research. So for instance, my area of work is pretrial publicity. When I do a study on pretrial publicity, it goes into an academic journal. And when I want to learn more about pretrial publicity and, I kind of tune out all the internet noise and all the media commentary, content, whatnot. But if I go to the academic journal articles, that's where I know the actual information is really going to be found. And academic journals have really high rejection rates. 90% is common, 80% is most of it. There's nothing that's lower than 60. Most of what gets submitted to an academic journal gets rejected. So that puts it at a pretty high rate. And to get accepted, the editor gets it and they can just reject it outright, or they can send it to 3 other people. Almost always those are 3 people with PhDs. And then that panel reviews it in a process called blind review. And if all of them say it's a good idea and it should be published and it makes a contribution, then it does get published. But most of the time it doesn't. So for an undergraduate like Erica Wood to get published in an academic journal is no small feat. And I will also say there are these things called impact scores that tell you how important the journal is or how prestigious it is or how influential it is. There's a lot of criticism of those ratings. I buy most of the criticism and they're kind of bogus, but from what I can tell, Studies in Musical Theater definitely falls in the top half of the rated journals overall and that are in all of the database. As you would expect from an academic journal article, Erica Wood's got 5 pages of footnotes. That comes close to 100. I didn't actually count it, but it's a lot. And this was fun. As I was looking up the journal to make sure it was credible before I did a whole podcast on it, I clicked on the link, and there's a 3-member editorial board. So the editors are the ones who do it, and then they send it out to reviewers. But Jessica Sternfeld is on the editorial board. If you heard any of the episodes on this podcast about mega musicals, you know that Jessica Sternfeld wrote the book called Mega Musical. She's got like the Mega Musical Bible. She's definitely a big deal in the world of musical theater. She teaches at Chapman University, which is real close to me, and she's on the editorial board of the journal that Erica Wood sent her journal to. Incidentally, so is Peter Kuntz, and both of those have been cited previously on Theater History and Mysteries. Jessica Sternfeld I cite all the time. Peter Kuntz wrote extensively about cats, but there's a bunch of episodes that cites his work. Anyway, there's Erica Wood sending her work to these giants of musical theater scholarship, and her article got accepted. So congratulations for all that. Anyway, Erica Wood is killing it as an undergraduate, getting her stuff into journals, and she has a lot to say about Hadestown. Let's figure it out what that is. Okay, before we start talking about autism and we start talking about Hadestown, I want to give a quick bit of background context on liberation theories. Some of this has appeared in previous episodes, but I think it's important to put it here too. Now, this is my own take. We're going to do a deeper dive with more elaborate theories in future episodes. And we talk about, lots of people are concerned about the environment, and there are a lot of ideas about what the best strategy is to try to do something to improve the situation for our environment. There is disagreement there. Here is what I think. I've read a lot of that stuff. I used to be a college debate coach. I've heard a bunch of really high-end debates on this. And so what I'm about to give you is my own distillation of a whole bunch of different approaches, but I think it holds true. I think it has value and it'll summarize well what happens when you try to approach a marginalized group of people. And I think understanding that at the outset is going to help us understand what Hadestown does with people who have autism. So say you have an excluded group of people, a class of people. Let's say they are women. Now, there are biological differences between men and women, to be sure, but those tend to get exaggerated and social meaning gets attached to them. And then privilege is given to one group and it is denied to the other. So it has undeniably been better to be a male over the last couple hundred, probably thousands of years of human history than it has been to be female. So there's a social role that gets created for people who have different characteristics. Then that gets treated like it's natural. That's inevitable. That's just the way the world works. When in fact, that's really just one ideological choice of many. So it might be something like mother or caregiver or something else. And then there's supposed to be an advantage to being in that role, but there's also a lot of constraints to go with it. So say you wanted to challenge all that. What are your solutions? Well, what are your solutions? How could you get rid of these ideologies and the way people talk about it? Well, one thing you could do is to try to make them equal. So if, for example, men are thought of as leaders and women are thought of as nurturers, you could point out that women could also be leaders. And then you are elevating women within this category of leadership. Now, the problem, though, that you're going to run into is that not all women want to be leaders. And part of the problem is that nurturing is very important, that we need nurturing in our society. We need, for example, nurses who nurture people back to health. We need good parents who can raise kids that do good things with their lives. And, the more we have good parents, the more we have good kids, the more we have a good society. So if you say the way women can liberate themselves is to be more like men, there is something that has been advanced there for sure, but you've also left out everything that is valuable about nurturing. Now, the second thing you can do, look at the value of the characteristics associated with the marginalized groups and try to elevate those categories. So you can say, let's make nurturing more important. Let's make nurse a job, make that a high status thing. And there's a lot of stuff about that. And it's true that nurse status has definitely increased, but it's also true that probably happened because males got into nursing. But for whatever reason, if you were saying, I want to attack heterosexist norms that are keeping women marginalized, one thing you can do is take those characteristics associated with being a woman and you can elevate those and say, instead of leadership being a thing we reward with a lot of money and a lot of power and a lot of status, and nurturing be a thing that we kind of pat on the head and said, hey, that's great, you're nurturing, we really, really respect you, but you're certainly not going to get paid for it and you don't get any legal or societal power from it. One thing you could say is we need to elevate the value of the things that those marginalized classes are good at. And if, one classic thing might be women who are nurturing, and so we need to value that more. Well, the problem is that women who are now not nurturing get left out. The people who didn't fit into the traditional female stereotype are now getting even more excluded than they were before. So just think of butch women or butch lesbian women. Those are people who never fit into the classic stereotype for a woman. They couldn't do the things men could do and get their awards for that. They could become leaders because they wouldn't be accepted because they were women. But now if you're saying, okay, but we want to elevate the nurturing component of being female, now you're even leaving them further out. So as you're trying to find the right mix, you might always find that you're leaving out entire classes of people. You might be leaving out transgendered people or gender fluid people or masculine females or feminine males or people who live at the intersections of all those identities or asexual people. There was one of the things that now is sort of embarrassing for them is Saturday Night Live once had a skit where the whole punchline was that there was a character named Pat and nobody could figure out whether or not Pat was male or female. And that was what generated all the comedy. People would make fun of Pat. And if you didn't fit clearly as either a male or a female, that just made you weird and somebody to laugh at. And that was the joke of that story. And so that's sort of what happens when there are categories. And if you don't fit in those categories, you're in deep trouble, and challenging those categories becomes difficult or impossible. But it is true, as long as there's a rigid binary and you're trying to fit people into it, then people like the character Pat won't, and they are going to be excluded and marginalized and ridiculed. So if you think through all of that, the issue might be what you really want to do is to eliminate the rigidity of social categories and detach them from gender roles. If there's only male and there's only female and there's one way males are supposed to act and one way females are supposed to act. And as you keep trying to say, all right, well, let's add this or take that away or valorize this, as you do that, you're never going to come up with a perfect matrix. And so a lot of people think the issue is to get rid of the binary altogether. Just say, okay, people have different genitalia, but whatever, that's not a big deal. It doesn't link to any important role that they could serve in society, or it doesn't really linked to anything that's important about them. Let's focus on the things that do make people good. Like if you're a good nurse, that should be rewarded. If you're a good leader, that too should be rewarded. And it shouldn't really matter whether or not you are born with male or female genitalia. And if you're born without either clear male or female genitalia, that too is not really an issue for you. So that is like a little 5-minute summary of liberation theories or questions of how you address marginalization and privilege. That's my own take, as I've said before. But I do think that to get rid of the binary categories and to break down common stereotypes, to let people be full, rich, and complex people is sort of where most people have landed on this question. Okay. So that's the background. That is basically liberation theory. But the particular thing we're going to talk about is not gender. It is, of course, autism. So let's spend a little while here getting used to the idea of autism. What is it and how does it play out, and how then might theater productively deal with this issue? What can we learn about theater and life as it relates to autism? Let's start with what is autism? Well, according to Wood, quote, autism, officially, the autism spectrum disorder, is a neurological and developmental condition that can impact social communication, executive function, intensity of interests, sensory experiences, and many other facets of life. End quote. And then Wood is citing the CDC, the Centers for Disease Control, on that question. There are other agencies that have other definitions. So just to break that down a little bit, social communication means that people who are autistic have difficulty reading social cues. And so they typically appear awkward. They themselves might feel awkward in social situations where they have more literal interpretations of what's going on. And so much of social communication is about context or nonverbal communication or implied meanings. Executive function, that means controlling what it is you're going to spend your time working on, and intensity of interest. So those two things together can end up with hyperfocus. So people who are on the autistic spectrum disorder might obsess about things more and way more than other people would. And they're also more into regularity. They need to have their executive function is very focused on things have to happen in a certain order. And if they don't happen in the right way, that can throw off an autistic person in a way it does not throw off people who do not have autism. And then sensory experiences are also that processing input from the world is different if you're a person with autism. And one thing that can happen is you can get overwhelmed. You can have sensory overload, and then that can kind of make you feel upset and behave in a way that makes you upset in ways that do not affect people who don't have autism. So that is kind of what it is like to be a person with autism. That's a very flat description. I know that if you are a person with autism, there's way more to it than that. But just to understand how it fits into the Orpheus character, that is kind of the quick background. Now, there's a National Autism Association, and according to that group, 1 in 31 people are somewhere on the autistic spectrum disorder. You probably know somebody who has at least some form of autism. Maybe it's Asperger's, maybe it's social anxiety. 41% of those who are autistic don't speak. That is, they are prelingual. It is also the fastest growing developmental issue that the medical field is tracking. But according to the National Autism Association, quote, autism greatly varies from person to person. No two people with autism are alike, end quote. So that is an important element to notice about autism, that just like there's cancer, but there's a bunch of different types of cancer. Not everybody who has cancer has the same thing. They don't experience it in the same way. They don't respond to treatments the same way. It would be inappropriate just to say, if you have cancer, we're just going to treat all cancer patients the same way. It is equally inappropriate to treat autistic people the same way. In fact, just about everybody who has a brain that works differently from all other brains. And for autistic people, that is especially acute. But it is interesting to note that the National Autism Association starts by noticing that there's a lot of diversity amongst people who have experienced autism. Okay, now, very quickly, it is most often treated as if it is a bad thing that needs a cure. This is according to Kieran Rose, who has their own website that talks about being accepted as an autistic person. I'm going to give you this extended quote. This is very much one way that people who have autism look at the way the world treats them. Now, I've got no answers from my own perspective, but I think Kieran Rose definitely has their own perspective. I'm putting it out there. We're going to contrast it with some others before, but I do think this does a pretty good job of bringing home at an emotional level what this diversity of autism question leads us to. Quote, Autism is seen as problem behavior. There are meltdowns, violent meltdowns. So that makes it okay to film your child at their most vulnerable and give it to a national newspaper and put it in front of millions of people. If you're diagnosed Aspergic, having Asperger's, you are a math genius who has no ability to empathize. If you're diagnosed autistic, you rock and dribble in the corner. We're stupid. We're retarded. We do something called autistic screaming. We have the mental ages of 5-year-olds, even when we're 30. We'll never leave home. We should never be allowed to procreate. We should be trained out of behaviors because they're so offensive to the general populace. End quote. That is one perspective, the perspective of Kieran Rose. It is a prominent perspective. It is an attempt to articulate for the world how it can feel to be an autistic person and have everyone treat you like you're weird all the time. That's sort of at a personal level, but how do people generally think about autism? So we've now kind of defined it. We know what that experience could be like for a person who is autistic. Well, there are two general frames that are used to approach this in the professional literature and just sort of overall. One is what Wood calls a traditional medical frame. And it's not that there isn't sympathy within that frame. It's not that people don't feel bad about people who have autism. It's that empathy is not present. You don't really understand what it's like to be a person with autism. So in frame number one, autism is treated as a medical problem. There should be a diagnosis, a treatment, and a cure. And I will read Wood here. I'm going to, there's a bunch of this quote that I'm ellipsing out. You can find the full text of the thing in the, where you to look up the article. That's obviously in the show notes. Just be aware that when I'm reading the quote here, I'm reading parts, but not all of it. I believe I am, however, not playing around with the context in a way to make it something that Wood would not have supported. Here we go. Quote. Autistic individuals tend to be relegated to supporting roles at best in their own stories. The experiences of autistic people were viewed largely as secondary to those of the neurotypical people who care of them. Parents publish memoirs about their experience, often emphasizing narratives that cast themselves as warrior heroes struggling to save their disabled children. Online, others publish tales of their parenting approaches, closely mimicking the classic hero's journey by featuring themselves as the hero, fighting against the villainous autism. Autism becomes an obstacle for brave parents and caregivers to face. In such attempts to rewrite the narrative around autism, allistic, non-autistic, caregivers can inadvertently cause the experiences of and efforts by autistic individuals to be diminished or overlooked, end quote. So notice that, and this was alluded to in the quote that I provided previously, the focus is typically not on the people who have autism, but on the parents of people who have autism. And also just remember that word allistic, that it refers to a non-person with autism, a person who does not have autism, but serves as a caregiver. That term will be important when we get to some of the quotes later. When the parents aren't portrayed as the heroes, the people with autism are portrayed in sympathetic but not empathetic terms in ways that emphasize the negative elements of autism. Here is another quote from Wood, quote, even in narratives told from the point of view of the autistic individual, undue focus on overcoming autism can reinforce stereotypes. Stories where a disabled person strives to conquer their disability rely on the all too persistent supercript stereotype. Such stories tend to reiterate limited narratives involving disabled individuals working to triumph by becoming non-disabled, end quote. So in all cases, the autism itself is viewed as a defect. If you have autism, you have a problem or you are a problem, but there's not really an acceptance that you being neuroatypical might just mean you have strengths and weaknesses. Now, there are things that having autism might actually enhance. Math is traditionally one, music is another. According to Wood, quote, both nonfiction and fiction narratives frequently rely on this trope when depicting disability. Some even go so far as to insinuate the idea that disabled people have worth only when their special skills cancel out their impairment, end quote. And in fact, in our previous episode, when we talked about how the Phantom of the Opera could save your life, one of the people who was on that show, who herself had autism, said, if what makes you different is something that somebody can make money on, then that's okay. And if what you have about you that's different is something that requires other people to put effort into you, then we think of it as a problem or a disease or something to be cured. Are you thinking Rain Man? I'm thinking Rain Man. Erica Wood is thinking Rain Man. Quote, Rain Man set a standard for autistic characters in the media. It gives Raymond the skills of a savant, Well, its plot focused instead on the ways the allistic characters learn to accept and embrace Raymond and thus become better people. Autistic characters often shoulder the additional burden of being used as comic relief. Stereotypical representations tend to commoditize autism for allistic eyes and to accentuate differences between autistic and allistic people, end quote. Okay, so that is frame number one. It is a medical problem to be overcome. It should be diagnosed, it should be treated, and it should be conquered. The real heroes are not the autistic people who have it. They are the allistic people who care for them and the challenges they face and that they need to overcome. And frequently, the autistic people themselves are taken out as characters in their own story. So the problem with the way you think it's thought about is it's very reductionistic, it's very medicalized, and there's no appreciation that the neuroatypicality might be an advantage. When it is viewed as an advantage, then typically that just gets exploited by allistic people. And a huge problem that autistic people experience is the lack of agency in their own stories because their brains do not function as everybody else's brains function. They are thought not even to be able to express who they are and what it's like to be them. All right, that is frame number one. Let's call that the traditional approach. Frame number two is the neurodiversity paradigm. We're going to have Erica Wood summarize this for us again. Quote, "There are three opposing axioms. 1, neurodiversity is normal and valuable. 2, the notion that there is a right way for human brains to function is a culturally constructed myth. And 3, neurodiversity creates dynamics similar to the diversity of race, gender, or sexuality, all of which can be used to create inequality or to foster creativity. In essence, the neurodiversity paradigm argues that neurodiversity is positive and natural." End quote. And then Wood does an excellent job of tracing the history of all this. Judy Singer was a self-advocate who coined the term neurodiversity to identify that while some people fall in the majority of the way brains operate, it is not inherently a disorder. It doesn't make you abnormal, and it definitely does not make you less human. There was also a psychologist named Nick Walker who used the term paradigm to emphasize a way of thinking that didn't treat it as a failure or a deficiency and to contrast it with the traditional cure-based models. And finally, psychologist Lawrence Fung makes the point that neurotypical people have also got strengths and weaknesses in their cognition, but their weaknesses aren't called disorders or pathologies. So the neurodiversity paradigm is the alternative to the traditional medical approach, and there are some important thinkers behind that approach. And I'll just point out, this is the category crashing approach. This is breaking through the binaries, that instead of saying there are neurotypical and neuroatypical people, and those are the two options you have, it's to say there's a huge amount of diversity, and really it's a spectrum that some people are completely normal, some people struggle quite a bit or have lots of characteristics that just don't work in a society that expects the brains to function differently. But this is of those various ways that we can go about approaching diversity and finding people with marginalized identities and making it a more inclusive world that brings them in. This neurodiversity paradigm approach is very much in that mold, that crashing the stereotypes is significant. Thinking in terms of spectrums is very important. My final thing that I'm going to mention here is that nobody is really clean when you approach these questions. Parenting is just hard. Judging out of experience is really hard. To be human is to make mistakes. If you enter questions of marginalization as privilege by looking for the magical formula that's going to put you in the perfect space, I mean, that you're not racist or sexist or ableist or whatever. Almost all of us have been all of those things at some point in our life. Either we have internalized it or we have externalized it, or we used to be that way and we're better now, but nobody ends up being perfect in any given moment. So there's still definitely better or worse. And like the theme of Hadestown itself, you fail, you try again, you try to do better next time, you look for clues along the way. And one of them is recognizing when a frame or a set of categories is doing more harm than good, or at least we can make our approach in a way of thinking about something a lot better than it currently is. But it's easy to be judgy. It's easy to be snarky. Lord knows I have adopted a snark tone on this podcast on more than one occasion. But I guess at least when thinking about these, let's just try to remember that the idea is not to find somebody who's making a mistake and point our finger at them and say, "Ha, you screwed it up." The point is to say, it's screwed up. we can make better choices. And some people might embrace that more or not, or embrace that less. But I think the more we just focus on how can we help the people that are in trouble, and we are authentically concerned for their well-being and making the world better, and the less we're concerned, this is just one way that I can feel a little bit better than you because my approach is a little bit more pure than yours, the better that will be. Yeah, you're getting if you're not an academic, you're getting a little glimpse into where it is we can go wrong most often. But I do think it's important just to kind of identify there is a different frame and it's more inclusive and that's better. But how we approach getting to the better frame is an important question on its own. Okay, so those are the two frames that are outside of theater. What is going on inside of theaters? Well, in theater, there just aren't many stories about autism at all, and there are even fewer autistic performances. That tends to magnify those portrayals of people who are autistic in the theater so that mistakes are a bigger deal. Doing it well seems like more of a victory. Here is a quick review. These, of course, all come from Wood. There was a show called How to Dance in Ohio. It featured 7 autistic players who portrayed 7 autistic characters. There was some feeling that it was a little one-dimensional and too much of a cheerleading thing. Maybe that's an important antidote to everything else in the world, but that was definitely a show that was out there that was one of the few that was definitely pushing in the right direction. There was the show The Curious Incident of the Dog in the Nighttime that ran in 2014. In the United Kingdom, there was a play called All in a Row that had a person with autism character portrayed by a gray puppet. That did not ring well to autistic people. The National Autistic Society eventually pulled its support for that. And this is more lists and exceptions that prove the rule. There's not a ton of musical theater and theater that deals directly with autism. The twin issues are there. Both the neurodivergent paradigm that is more accepting and tries to crash it. There's also the more traditional thing that talks about the struggles of people who deal with autism and that almost always take them out of the story and focus on the people who are dealing, the allistic people who are providing support for the people with autism. But bottom line, not a lot of stories about autism and not a lot of performers with autism in theater, which gets us to Hadestown. So what is going on with Hadestown? It inherits these two big approaches to autism, and it is a piece of musical theater that's being presented in the context of musical theater that does not frequently deal with autism. Okay, well, in our last episode, we learned that Mitchell developed the story between 2006 and about 2019, and every time it went to a new theater, it went through a new iteration, it changed quite a bit. The earliest versions of Orpheus made him appear too arrogant. And R.A. Smith of Baylor University is a professor of the classics, and he says that in the classic Greek stories, it is true Orpheus is just kind of a vain guy. And so what Mitchell did was intentionally change that character, intentionally changed Orpheus to make him be all art and music and nothing practical but likable. That for Mitchell to explain why is it Orpheus at the last minute, as he's almost got out of hell with Eurydice, why does he turn around? The answer is, well, he can't do anything else. He's all art. He's all music. He's not practical. He has self-doubt. And who he is what drives that decision. But that does mean he represents art and music, and that is contrasted with Hades, who represents materialism and industrialism and material success. This was all fleshed out quite a bit in the last episode. I'm not going to rehash the whole thing, but there are some quotes that we pulled from Aeneas Mitchell's book. The title of that book is Working on a Song, and it showed the ways that they transformed him into a naive genius. Here's a couple of shorter quotes that I think captured that. On page 95, Mitchell writes, quote, "In the lead up to Broadway, when I began reframing Orpheus as naive, otherworldly, touched by the gods," and those are italicized in the book, "it suddenly seemed nature that instead of ignoring Eurydice, Orpheus doesn't even hear her." And there's this exchange where Eurydice is calling out to Orpheus about getting firewood. That's something practical. He does not respond to her. And as the show developed, that went from being he was ignoring her to who he was made it impossible for him to hear her. And then again on page 111, quote, "I began to truly suspect that no amount of poetic imagery or internal rhythm prowess were going to make us fall in love with Orpheus. It was the naive, heart-on-the-sleeve beauty of his singing voice alone that might move us. Allowing Hermes to approach him unheard again depicted him as a boy lost in his own world, end quote. And that's the phrase I would like to focus on. He's a boy lost in his own world. He can't even hear other people. You might call that hyperfocus. Now, he is not explicitly located and identified as autistic, but he's definitely neurodivergent. His brain does not work the way most other people's do. And in some ways, that's an advantage because it allows him to make beautiful music that nobody else can make. And in some ways, it's a disadvantage because at least in the Hadestown version of the story, he is not capable of providing the material things that he and Eurydice need to stay alive and to get along with each other. And ultimately, that's why Eurydice says, I love you, but I just can't do this. I know who you are. I know what you are. I know that your brain does not work like my brain. And for those reasons, the two of us are not compatible as lovers. Now, there is another close connection. This one comes entirely from Wood. Reeve Carney is the person who played Orpheus. He appeared on the Patrick Page podcast, and Patrick Page is a rather large musical theater presence. He provides a lot of training, advice, and perspectives. And Page said to Reeve Carney that one autistic listener had written in to say that the Orpheus character had many characteristics that were shared by those in the autistic community. And Patrick Page, by the way, did not have a formal role in Hadestown, but Mitchell cites him as being especially influential. And then Wood cites Mitchell, identifying that Page had an influence on the way that they were thinking. And then this comes from Wood's article, quote, Carney previously stated that initially, after reading the script changes, he asked Aeneas Mitchell and director Rachel Chavkin whether Orpheus was autistic, but did not receive a definitive answer, end quote. And the citation that is provided comes from that Patrick Page podcast. Wood cites Patrick Page as the source of that quote. Carney says, according to Wood, that he is frequently asked this question, is Orpheus autistic? And he doesn't have a clear answer, although he does feel honored when people see themselves in his character. But Carney also says that part of what he drew on to portray this character, the new character, as Mitchell and Chavkin were saying, we're going to make this guy from being arrogant to just being naive, the pure personification of art over practicality, and a guy lost in his own world. As Carney was trying to figure out, well, how do I play that? He says that he drew on the beautiful innocence, quote, beautiful innocence, end quote, of an autistic friend of his. So there's definitely some kind of role in there. And in the article, Wood definitely spent some time thinking about how do you classify that? Does that mean that we can officially say that Orpheus is autistic, or is it just that audience members think that he's autistic, and ends up kind of in the middle? I don't think it's that important for our purposes that we put the category on whether it is. But short of saying explicitly that Orpheus is an autistic character, it is also clear that Orpheus is a lot of things. And if an audience member sees that they are autistic or at least neurodivergent, they're definitely not wrong per se. It is one viable interpretation of the character. There's not an explicit declaration that the character is autistic or even neurodivergent per se, but there's definitely an idea that his brain works differently than all other brains, and that is a totally reasonable interpretation. Okay, so let's get on to Wood's research. So far, everything that Wood has said has been citing other people's things that she has found in the media or in other sources. Wood's original research starts by noticing that big musicals develop online communities of dedicated fans. And the Broadway Reddit, in fact, has 235,000 followers, which puts it in the top 1% of all the Reddit discussion boards. And Wood's research is published in the year 2025, so it is hot off the press. That is about as recent as yet in academic research. Wood notes that others have studied those online posts. So other scholars, when they're looking for audience reaction, go to Reddit posts as a way of understanding the meaning of a show and what that has for the audience. And so that's what Wood decides that she's going to do for Hadestown. And this creates an important intersection for people with autism. I'm going to do a pretty extensive quote here because I think it encapsulates what's up with musical theater, people with autism, and the internet. Quote, even outside of musical theater contexts, many individuals who identify as autistic use online forums to discuss their interpretations of characters they read as possibly autistic. Such a practice is rooted in the very foundation of the autistic community. The autistic activist and pioneer of the neurodiversity movement, Jim Sinclair, for example, was deeply influenced by seeing their experiences represented in the media. In their subsequent search to find other autistic people, they helped create the Autism Network International, the original safe space for autistics. Because the internet circumvents many of the challenges autistic people face during in-person social interactions, it has become a core venue for autistic people to connect with one another. Online spaces have become cornerstones for the autistic community, end quote. So Erica Wood is saying, I'm going to look at these online communities because that is an important place that autistic people go to interpret characters, to understand characters, and to talk about how those characters are portrayed in the media. And the fact that it is mediated through the internet is actually a big advantage to people with autism. So Woods scoured Reddit to see any discussions of Orpheus as autistic and found 81 different comments that had been posted from 65 different posters on 6 different discussion topics, and excluded some stuff that seemed like filler, but found that corpus of discussion that Wood wanted to explore. Here is what Wood found. Some of the commentators argued that the Broadway version of Hadestown, Orpheus is not autistic, so there's definitely people who are saying he's not, but 60%, 37 out of 62, said that he was. Some of the people who had autism argued that if Orpheus was intended to be autistic, the way he was depicted was offensive. Some people said it's like, if that's intended to be autism, that sounds to me like a middle schooler trying to make fun of autistic people. But there were also many who came to the opposite conclusion, many who did think that the Orpheus character exhibited autism and that they could relate to it. One quote was, quote, "Personally, as someone with ASD, that's autism spectrum disorder, Orpheus is a comfort character for me, and I did enjoy the portrayal Reeve had done," end quote. Some really did not. Quote, "I really want to kill that Reeve's Orpheus is autistic discourse dead. If he is going for neurodivergent, he's playing into some terrible stereotypes," end quote. Now, if you're talking about a marginalized community, disagreement is to be expected. Being a woman of color doesn't necessarily mean that you have to like Kamala Harris, and being slightly overweight, middle class, white male doesn't necessarily mean that you have to like Donald Trump. In fact, privilege is being able to deviate from stereotypes. There being so many people in your character being so accepted that how can you be a white male? Well, you could just be a good dad, or you could be a CEO, or you could be an NFL football player who plays quarterback, or you could be a commentator or a news journalist, because nobody looks and says, what's the white guy doing trying to do that? But if you have a marginalized identity, then that identity is going to be part of what sets you outside of stereotypes. And so almost saying that all marginalized people should think the same way is just about as offensive as saying that is as offensive as locking them into the categories and then giving negative things to it. Okay. Wood's interpretation of the story puts Hadestown in the category of things that do not lock autistic people into a single stereotyped category. Quote, "Orpheus's arc in Hadestown does not fall into the common traps of many other autism narratives," end quote. Orpheus is a hero first, and he's a neurodivergent character second. That's how Mitchell developed him, and that's how he shows up in the narrative. The story is not about his neurodivergence. It's about his choices. And who he is definitely going to inform that, but he's not going to be exclusively, his role in the story is not exclusively defined by that in any plot. There's a lot of characters that have a lot of different characteristics, and they interact with one another, and they interact with the action. And to make those characters flat, cardboard cutout stereotypes is a problem, and he's not a character like that. Quote, "He may be a character who displays autistic traits, but his heroism is the story," end quote. And remember, at the end of this show, we are lifting our cups to Orpheus. Whoever he is, whatever it is about him that made him try to sing that song to Hades, which is also probably whatever it is about him that made him look back at the end, the fact that his naivete, the way that he is, his extreme focus on his art and his music, that's the reason he's also got to try again. And to that, we raise a cup by the end of the story. And I liken all of this to the Star Trek series. There is diversity on that ship. There's diversity on the helm. Uhura and Solo and Chekhov are all clearly linked to their race and culture. And as a kid born in 1960 something, growing up right as Star Wars was like the big show that you watched, you could not miss that there was a black character. And there was an Asian character, and there was a Russian character, and he was white, sure, but he was Russian. That was not necessarily a cool thing in the 1970s. They were all rich, different characters, and they were all clearly linked to the race and culture, but they were also all fully functioning members of the crew. So the race was not all that defined them. Their culture was not all that defined them. What their main function was to serve their different roles that they served on the Enterprise, but you couldn't miss that their race was part of them. And it really stood out at the time. And I do think that that's kind of what Mitchell's able to accomplish with Orpheus, that he is not just a neurodivergent character, that he's central to the story and is also a neurodivergent person. Wood explicitly links this to the neurodiversity paradigm and says, this show is a great example of that neurodiversity paradigm, that alternative way of looking at autism that challenges the traditional view that is very limiting. And as a result, Wood finds this to be a very productive presentation of autistic characters. And awesomely, Erica Wood's frame for this whole thing is he gives a new reason about why it is that he turns back. So remember in Virgil, he turns back just because humans do that, and he has a moment of dementia. In Ovid's telling, those are the two original Roman poets, in Ovid's telling, he turns back for love. In Mitchell's version, at least her own descriptions, he turns back out of doubt because he is his talent, but he doesn't really have too much that's behind his talent. And so when he has to draw on courage rather than musical ability, he can't do it. The faith was never in himself in the first place. But Erica Wood has a completely different version, a different explanation for why is it that he turns back. He turns back because he is overstimulated. And this is evident in some of the posts that Erica Wood was studying that had been put there by people with autism who saw the show, related to the character as a fellow autistic, and said, hey, I get why he turned back. He turned back because he was overstimulated, because I would feel overstimulated in that situation. And also because he struggles with rules, that if you're a person with autism, you approach the world in a more literal way. You have comfort in regulated behavior, and that's associated with your the way your brain works. And those changing of the rules of Hades, where Hades is like, okay, we're supposed to come here forever, and you're saying, can you leave? And I'm saying, haha, you can leave, but you have to do that by walking out without looking back. And then there's all the action with all the other people who are in hell with Hades as that's going on. That is a problem for people who are neurodivergent. That's a lot going on. In Erica Wood's interpretation, the song Doubt Comes In is an attempt to understand a world where people lie and don't follow the rules. And this is really upsetting to somebody who thrives on regularity. He also doesn't recognize his own difference. And this resonates with the people who are diagnosed later in life, including the people that were kind enough to talk to me on my show, that a whole chunk, like, why do you have self-doubt? Well, if you're an autistic person, you're constantly asking, why isn't this working for me? What is it about me that is making me not fit in with everybody else, not make friends the way other people seem to be making friends, not thinking about the world the way other people do? And that is the cause of the self-doubt. And so Orpheus's failure to recognize his own difference. Why is it I'm so into my music and Eurydice, likes my music, but wants me to do all this other stuff too, this time music? I don't get that. Why are we so different? Well, one interpretation is that is what causes self-doubt. And according to Erica Wood, that's part of what makes him turn back. And the repetition of that question, who am I, which definitely happens in Hadestown, replicates a very specific autistic behavior. And it's also a big question that those who have later in life diagnoses, who am I? Who am I? Who am I? And he keeps asking that question. And that resonates with people who had autism their whole life, never had an explanation for it, and were constantly asking that question themselves. That's a lot of words I'm using to try to explain this. Let's put it all together like this. It is a quote from Erica Wood, quote, Orpheus turns at the end of Hadestown because his worldview has been shattered along with his innocence. He no longer understands how he fits in a world where rules and promises are not honored. End quote. And the end result is a story that happens completely outside the conscriptions of stereotypes that you might find in the traditional model of autism. Quote, By framing Orpheus's experiences through his strengths and weaknesses, his whole humanity, audience members of all neurotypes are encouraged to empathize with him. That is what we've talked about today. So let's wrap this up and see if we can put some conclusions on it. In the world of autism, there are two main approaches. One way is to treat it as a disorder to be cured and to treat autistic people as somebody who's a problem or has a pathology. That's one approach. And the alternative, the second approach, is you can identify that everyone has brains that operate differently and we all have strengths and weaknesses. And we could recognize that life is pretty hard for everyone, but it's way easier if you don't have the majority of society calling your weaknesses a pathology. Now, I don't want to go all Michel Foucault here, but there definitely in human history have been societies where people who are neurodivergent have been respected or revered or at least treated well or at least been given space to be themselves. But in our modern Cartesian, Western, reductionistic world, we tend to put them in institutions where we seek to control them or medicate them in the name of curing them. Now, I'm not suggesting that there are no psychological conditions that need treatment and that autistic people should just kind of be left to their own to do it without any interaction or accounting for who they are. But if there is a cosmic balance out there between we need to provide supports that are necessary but respectful, and we need to treat this as a problem to be cured and put people who are different from the norm into institutions and lock them away and medicate them so they're not a problem anymore. That balance has been tipped way too far in Western society in the medication, in the institutionalization direction. That's kind of the whole point of Michel Foucault's work. And it's definitely something that seems to be happening with autism. And as the number of people who experience autism is growing, and according to the National Autism Network, that is the fastest growing condition that young people face, that new babies and very young children face. Maybe we need to start thinking about what's a better way to do that. We cannot take 1 out of 31 people and put them in an institution and lock them away and just feel like we can medicate this way. We need a different way of thinking about this issue. That's the world at large. Theater is a place where those with marginalized identities have both found exclusion and acceptance. There are certainly female performers and Jewish performers and performers of color who have found a home in theater, that they, who they are, the thing, their identity about them, that it does not work from in other places, works in their favor in theater more than it works in other places. But there's certainly many, many others who have not. And I think even successful Jewish performers like Groucho Marx, it was kind of there at the start of the creation of Hollywood. He was definitely a performer. He was openly Jewish, and he dealt with a bunch of people who were openly anti-Semitic. He did all that stuff. He found a place in theater, but his Jewish identity never really went away, and it never really stopped others from looking down on him. So that's kind of what theater is. It can be a place where you can find liberation, but it's a place where exclusion never really goes away. And I will just say, and theater is one big, massive ego threat. Most people, I think I've said this before, but most people who audition for a part don't get the part. Most people who write a play never get to see their play performed. If their play does get performed, it almost never goes commercial. Very few go commercial. And if there is a commercial version of the play, it very rarely becomes a Broadway smash hit. If you start out in theater, you are probably going to fail many, 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 many times over. And on top of that, marginalized identities, that just makes it that much more difficult for people who have those identities to find a space. But by God, there are times where theater does that. It becomes the haven. When we talked to Michael Despars, our superstar high school theater figure on previous episodes, theater can be the place where some people find their space. And trying to make that space better and more inclusive is just part of the lesson we can learn about life and about theater. How can we make theater and life better? And the answer is that neurodivergent approach is just way, way, way better than being too medicalized. So at this moment, in theater in general, and those who are taking on the Orpheus story in particular, have made very concerted efforts to expand the circle and to be more inclusive, and their efforts have been more or less successful. And Erica Wood thinks, and I agree, that Anais Mitchell's telling of the story succeeds in this regard. In the last episode, one of the things I think that you might have missed is giving Orpheus a big 11 o'clock number in his big confrontation with Hades. But one thing I think she succeeds is in presenting Orpheus as a complex character. He's still a heroic character that neurodivergent people can see themselves in without it feeling stereotyped. I will let Erica Wood end with this quote, Hadestown also offers a particularly insightful answer to the question of why Orpheus turns. The world could be hard on autistic people, and as humans, autistic people can only take so much from the world. But the world does not have to be this way. As Hermes suggests, maybe next time it will turn out well. End quote. And I just want to close by acknowledging that there are definitely people with autism who don't feel that way and feel offended by the portrayal of Hadestown. But to me, that is also part of eliminating stereotypes. If you were to say all Black people like, fill in the stereotype here, pick a food item, pick a musical style, that would be a problem. Not all Black people are the same. Hadestown doesn't work for all people with autism, but neither does it create a character who stops being a hero and is a cardboard cutout. And the fact that different people can interpret this complex character in different ways, I think, is what the best you can do when you're trying to create a more inclusive space in theater. It works for a lot of people. It worked for Erica Wood, and it works for me. But it is not the only theme in Hadestown. Hadestown talks about the environment, and it talks about race and class and gender, and there is mining. It is very explicitly in the story. It is what hell is like, that the oppression happens in the mining community. If there's liberation, it's got to also happen in the mining community. That is more central to the Hadestown than you might think, and it's also more central to the overall history of liberation in American society than you might think. And we'll explore those and other connections in future episodes. We will find the pools that those issues are swimming in, and we're going to dive into the deep end in our coming episodes of Theater, History, and Mysteries.